The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets as Emma stood on the marble steps of the mansion she'd called home for 5 years, her mother Catherine shivering beside her in a thin cardigan. But neither woman knew that Catherine wasn't just the quiet, humble woman who'd raised Emma in a modest apartment. She was secretly the trillionaire owner of the very corporation that had made Emma's husband rich. David, Emma's husband of 5 years, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his expensive suit pristine against the warm light spilling from inside, but his eyes held nothing except cold contempt as he blocked their entry to the home Emma had decorated, the home where she'd cooked his meals and ironed his shirts and swallowed her pride 1,000 times. Behind David, his mistress Veronica draped herself across the leather sofa Emma had picked out for their 2nd anniversary, her laughter echoing through the foyer like shattered glass. But that laughter would soon turn to ash when the truth emerged. Emma clutched the single suitcase David had thrown at her feet, her wedding ring still on her finger but feeling like a shackle now, her mother's frail hand gripping her arm as the wind howled around them. But neither could have predicted that this moment of ultimate humiliation would become the catalyst for David's complete and utter destruction. Catherine's lips trembled as she looked at the man who'd stolen her daughter's light, but she said nothing. Her secret buried so deep that even Emma had no idea her mother owned the company where David served as vice president, the company that had given him everything he had, the company that could take it all away with a single phone call. The snow began to cover their shoulders as David sneered and reached for the door, Veronica's mocking voice calling out something cruel about dead weight and finally free. But what neither of them understood was that the fragile old woman standing in the freezing night held more power in her pinky finger than David would accumulate in 10 lifetimes. Emma's heart shattered as the door slammed shut, the sound of the lock clicking into place like a gunshot in the winter silence. But something flickered in Catherine's eyes then, something ancient and fierce and absolutely merciless. Would Emma discover her mother's true identity before hypothermia set in, or would Catherine reveal herself in a way that would make David wish he'd never been born? Would Veronica's laughter fade when she realized she'd mocked the woman who could erase David's entire existence with a signature? Would David's cruelty on this frozen night become the biggest mistake of his miserable life, and would Emma find the strength to watch him fall? Or would mercy stay her hand when the moment of reckoning finally arrived? The beginning of the end started 6 hours before Emma found herself standing in the snow, but the seeds of destruction had been planted much earlier, 5 years earlier to be precise, on the day she'd met David Harrison at a charity gala she'd only attended because her mother had insisted. Emma had been 23 then, fresh out of college with a degree in art history and dreams of opening her own gallery. But those dreams felt distant and foolish now as she thought back to that fateful night. David had been 28, sharp-suited and confident, working as a junior executive at Meridian Global Industries, but his ambition radiated off him like heat from asphalt in summer. "You look lost," he'd said, handing her a glass of champagne she hadn't asked for. But his smile had been warm then, genuine, or at least she'd believed it was genuine. Emma had laughed, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear, but she'd felt the flutter of attraction even as warning bells whispered in the back of her mind. "Just overwhelmed," she'd admitted, gesturing to the crowd of wealthy donors and corporate executives, but David had taken her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Let me overwhelm you," he'd said, leading her to a quieter corner. But what Emma hadn't known was that David had already done his research. He'd seen her arrive with Catherine, had noticed the way people greeted her mother with careful respect, had assumed Catherine had money hidden somewhere, despite her modest appearance. Catherine had been watching from across the room that night. her gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. But she'd said nothing when Emma introduced David an hour later, merely smiled and shook his hand with the grip of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. Catherine Monroe had started with a single patent 40 years ago, a revolutionary semiconductor design she'd created in her garage, but she'd parlayed that into Meridian Global Industries, a technology conglomerate worth $800 billion. No one knew Catherine owned the company, but that was exactly how she wanted it. She operated through layers of holding companies and trusts, her name appearing nowhere in public records, her face unknown to the shareholders and executives who worked beneath her invisible hand. The courtship had been whirlwind, but Emma had been young and naive and starving for affection. Her demanding, career-focused mother had never quite provided, or so she'd thought. David had proposed after 6 months, but the ring had been modest, something he'd saved for, and Emma had loved him more for the sacrifice she'd believed it represented. Catherine had offered to pay for the wedding, but Emma had refused, wanting to do it themselves, wanting to prove they could build something real without help. "Your mother doesn't like me," David had said one night during their engagement, his voice tight with resentment, but Emma had rushed to reassure him. "She's just protective," Emma had insisted, but deep down she'd wondered if her mother saw something she was blind to. Catherine had worn a simple gray dress to the wedding, sitting in the front row with an expression Emma couldn't quite read, but she'd handed them an envelope afterward containing a check for $50,000, a gift Emma had thought extraordinarily generous for a woman who'd always lived so modestly. David had deposited it the next day, but his complaints about Catherine had only increased. His subtle digs about her weird energy and judgmental attitude, slowly poisoning Emma's relationship with her mother. The first year of marriage had been manageable, but cracks had appeared when David's career began its meteoric rise at Meridian Global. He'd been promoted to senior executive after 18 months, but the timing had seemed almost miraculous, his name suddenly appearing on shortlists and receiving opportunities that others with more experience overlooked. Emma had been proud, but she'd also noticed how David changed, how the man who'd once brought her coffee in bed now expected her to have his breakfast ready before he left for work at 6 a.m. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," David would snap when she tried to discuss their deteriorating relationship. But his phone had started lighting up at all hours with messages he'd angle away from her view. Veronica Castellano had entered their lives 2 years into the marriage, but Emma hadn't recognized her as a threat initially. She'd been David's new assistant, efficient and cold and beautiful, in a way that made Emma feel frumpy in her paint-stained jeans. David had insisted Veronica needed to attend dinners and business trips, but Emma had swallowed her discomfort, trusting her husband even as that trust began to curdle in her stomach. Catherine had visited less and less frequently, but the distance between mother and daughter had grown like a cancer, fed by David's constant criticism and Emma's exhausted compliance. Emma hadn't known that Catherine stayed away to protect her, to avoid drawing attention to their connection, to keep David from ever discovering who she really was, but the isolation had been crushing nonetheless. "Your mother called again," David had said one evening about 6 months ago, his lip curling with disgust, but he'd deleted the voicemail before Emma could listen to it. Emma had felt something break inside her that day, but she'd said nothing, just as she'd said nothing about the lipstick on David's collar, or the perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his shirts, or the way he'd stopped touching her months ago. The truth about David's affair had come out 3 months before this frozen night, but not through any confession or discovery. Veronica herself had told Emma, sitting across from her at a coffee shop with a smile that could cut glass. "I wanted you to hear it from me," Veronica had said, stirring her latte with studied casualness, but her eyes had gleamed with cruel satisfaction. "David and I are in love. He's going to ask you for a divorce." Emma had felt the world tilt, but she'd maintained her composure, her hands wrapped around her cup to stop them from shaking. "How long?" she'd asked, but she'd already known the answer would destroy her. "Almost from the beginning," Veronica had admitted, leaning forward conspiratorially. But there'd been nothing friendly in her expression. "You were just convenient, the wife who made him look stable while he climbed the ladder, but now he doesn't need you anymore." Emma had left the coffee shop in a daze, but she'd confronted David that night, her voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. He'd denied it at first, but his denials had been half-hearted, and within minutes he'd switched to anger. "What did you expect?" David had shouted, his face twisted with contempt, but every word had felt like a physical blow. "You think I wanted to come home to someone who'd given up on everything? You were supposed to be this artistic, ambitious woman, but you became a housewife who can't even give me children." They'd been trying for a baby for 2 years, but the fertility issues had been on both sides, according to the doctors, something David conveniently forgot when he wanted ammunition. Emma had started crying then, but her tears had only enraged him further. "I'm done," he'd declared, but he hadn't moved out, hadn't filed papers, had simply made Emma's existence in their home increasingly unbearable, while Veronica began appearing at the house for work sessions that lasted until midnight. Emma had called her mother that night, but Catherine had been traveling for business, or so her assistant had said, and the call had gone to voicemail. Emma had left a tearful message, but Catherine hadn't called back for 3 days, and by then Emma's pride had rebuilt enough that she'd pretended everything was fine. What Emma hadn't known was that Catherine had been in emergency meetings with her board of directors, but the crisis had been manufactured by David himself. A bold play to restructure a division he'd been angling to control, but his proposal had been so reckless it could have cost the company billions. Catherine had been watching David for years through her network of trusted executives, but this move had been the final straw, the confirmation that he was everything she'd feared, and worse. The day of the exile had started ordinarily enough, but Emma had sensed something brewing in the tension that crackled through the house like electricity before a storm. David had been home when she'd woken up, unusual for a weekday, but he'd been in his study with Veronica, their voices low and conspiratorial. Emma had called her mother that morning on impulse, but Catherine had answered immediately. This time, her voice warm and urgent. "I'm coming over," Catherine had said, but Emma had heard something in her tone that sounded almost like preparation. "You don't have to," Emma had protested, but secretly she'd been relieved. Desperate for any ally in the battlefield, her marriage had become. "I want to see you," Catherine had insisted, but what she hadn't said was, "I need to be there when this happens. I need to protect you from what's coming. I need to finally stop hiding and let you see who I really am." Catherine had arrived an hour later, but Emma had been shocked by her mother's appearance. The gray hair Emma remembered had been professionally colored to a rich auburn, the wire-rimmed glasses replaced with designer frames, the frumpy cardigan swapped for a tailored coat that screamed old money. Catherine had looked like a different person, but Emma had been too stressed to fully process the transformation. "Mom, what?" Emma had started, but Catherine had pulled her into a fierce hug that felt like armor and absolution combined. "We need to talk," Catherine had said, but before she could continue, David had emerged from his study with Veronica at his heels, his eyes widening with something like shock when he saw Catherine. "What is she doing here?" David had demanded, but his voice had carried an edge Emma had never heard before, something almost like fear, but that couldn't be right, could it? "I invited her," Emma had said firmly, but her hands had been shaking as she'd gripped her mother's arm. David's face had contorted with rage. But Veronica had whispered something in his ear that made him smile, a terrible, vicious smile that had sent ice through Emma's veins. "Actually, this is perfect timing," David had announced, striding into the living room like a king addressing peasants. But his next words had shattered Emma's world into pieces too small to ever fit back together. "I want you out. Today, both of you." Emma had stared at him in disbelief, but Catherine had gone very, very still beside her, the stillness of a predator before it strikes. "This is my house too," Emma had protested weakly, but David had laughed, and Veronica had joined in, her laughter high and mocking. "Actually, it's not," David had said, pulling papers from his jacket, but his smugness had been so thick Emma could taste it. "The house is in my name. I've been documenting your mental instability for months, depression, paranoia, inability to fulfill your wifely duties." He gestured to Veronica. "My assistant has been helping me compile evidence for the divorce. You get nothing." Catherine had stepped forward then, but her voice had been soft, almost gentle, which had somehow been more frightening than if she'd shouted. "You're making a mistake," she'd said, but David had waved her off like an annoying insect. "The only mistake I made was marrying your pathetic daughter," David had spat. But Veronica had draped herself over his shoulder, her perfectly manicured hand possessive on his chest. "Now get out before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Emma had felt her legs go weak, but Catherine had caught her, supporting her weight with surprising strength for a woman in her 60s. "You heard him," Veronica had purred from her position on the sofa, examining her nails with studied boredom, but her eyes had been alive with malicious joy. "Time to take your mother and your dignity. Oh, wait. You don't have any dignity left, and go freeze somewhere else." The packing had been humiliating, but David had supervised with crossed arms while Veronica had made comments about every item Emma tried to take. "Those earrings, David bought those. That photo album, I think that's community property, so it stays. That coat, too expensive for someone about to be homeless." Emma had been allowed exactly one suitcase, but most of it had been filled with photos and sentimental items she couldn't bear to leave behind rather than practical warm clothing. Catherine had tried to grab more supplies, but David had physically blocked her, shoving the older woman back with enough force that she'd stumbled. "Don't touch my mother," Emma had screamed, but her voice had been raw and broken, and David had just laughed. "What are you going to do about it?" he'd taunted, but something had flickered across Catherine's face then, something that had made David step back unconsciously despite his bravado. The walk to the front door had felt like a funeral procession, but Emma had been unable to stop crying, her whole body shaking with grief and shock and the kind of rage that burns so hot it becomes cold. Catherine had been silent, but her arm around Emma's waist had been iron strong, unyielding, protective in a way Emma couldn't remember her mother ever being before. "Wait!" Veronica had called out just as they'd reached the threshold, but her voice had been syrupy sweet with false concern. "You should know, David and I are getting married next month, here, in your house. I'm going to redecorate everything, erase every trace of you. It'll be like you never existed." That had been when David had pushed them out into the snow, but his hands had been rough on Emma's shoulders, shoving her down the steps while Catherine had tried to keep them both upright. The door had slammed behind them, but through the window Emma had seen David pull Veronica into a kiss, his hands tangling in her hair, and the laughter that had followed them out into the freezing night had sounded like demons celebrating. The cold had been instant and brutal, but Emma had been too numb emotionally to fully process the physical danger they were in. Catherine had pulled out her phone immediately, but her fingers had been steady despite the temperature, and she'd made a call that Emma could barely hear over the wind. "It's time," Catherine had said into the phone, but her voice had carried absolute authority. "Execute Protocol 7, full disclosure, and send a car to the Harrison residence immediately." Emma had looked at her mother in confusion, but Catherine had been focused on keeping them moving, guiding them toward the street where a sleek black car had materialized with impossible speed. The driver had jumped out, wrapping them both in heavy blankets and ushering them into the heated interior, but Emma had been too disoriented to ask questions. "Hospital first," Catherine had ordered, but the driver had simply nodded, and Emma had realized with dawning shock that this man knew her mother, respected her, obeyed her without question. "Mom, what's going on?" Emma had finally managed, but her teeth had been chattering so hard she'd barely gotten the words out. Catherine had pulled Emma close, rubbing warmth back into her daughter's frozen hands, but her eyes had been fixed on the mansion receding behind them, and the expression on her face had been one of absolute calculated fury. "I should have told you years ago," Catherine had said, but her voice had been thick with regret. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping you separate from my world. I thought if David never knew, he couldn't use it against you. But I was wrong. I should have crushed him the moment he showed his true colors." The hospital had been a blur of warm blankets and concerned doctors, but Emma and Catherine had been treated like royalty, whisked into a private suite that didn't appear on any directory. Emma had been given hot tea and checked for frostbite, but the physical injuries had been minor compared to the emotional devastation that was slowly crystallizing into something harder, colder, more permanent. Catherine had dismissed the medical staff and locked the door, but when she'd turned to face Emma, there had been tears streaming down her cheeks, the first time Emma had seen her mother cry since she was a child. "I need to tell you everything," Catherine had said, but she'd sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of her 63 years. The revelation had taken 2 hours, but with every sentence, Emma's understanding of her entire life had shifted and reformed like a kaleidoscope. Catherine hadn't been the modest, simple woman Emma had believed her to be, but rather the hidden architect of a technological empire that spanned 40 countries and employed over 300,000 people. The patents Catherine held had revolutionized computing, telecommunications, and artificial intelligence, but she'd kept her ownership secret through a complex web of trusts and shell companies appearing to the world as simply another employee. "Why?" Emma had whispered, but her mind had been reeling with implications. "Control," Catherine had admitted, but her voice had been sad rather than prideful. "If people knew who I was, I'd never know if they wanted me or my money. Your father—" She'd paused, pain flickering across her face, but Emma had leaned forward, desperate to finally understand. "What about Dad?" Emma had asked, but she'd barely remembered the man who died when she was 3, just vague impressions of laughter and gentle hands. "He didn't know either," Catherine had confessed, but her voice had broken on the words. "By the time I realized I should tell him, he was already sick, pancreatic cancer, gone in 3 months. I thought about telling him at the end, but I didn't want his last thoughts to be wondering if our entire marriage was a lie." She'd gripped Emma's hands tightly, but her eyes had been pleading. "I loved him, truly loved him, and I loved you. I kept myself hidden because I wanted us to be normal, to be safe, to not be targets." Emma had processed this slowly, but pieces had started clicking into place. The modest apartment that had somehow been in one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings, the retired teacher mother, who'd somehow afforded to send Emma to Princeton without loans, the way Catherine had always been traveling for work, but never explained what work that was. Meridian Global, Emma had breathed, but the truth had hit her like a freight train. "You own the company where David works." Catherine had nodded grimly, but her jaw had been set with determination. "I own the company where David thought he was building his empire. Every promotion he received, I could have stopped it with a word, but I wanted to see what he'd do, how far he'd go. I wanted proof of what he really was before I acted. Her voice had gone cold, but the ice in it had been nothing compared to the fire in her eyes. And now I have more than enough proof. Now I'm going to destroy him. The plan had unfolded over the next week, but Catherine had orchestrated it with the precision of someone who'd spent 40 years outmaneuvering competitors and hostile takeovers. Emma had stayed with her mother in a penthouse she'd never known existed, but the space had been filled with evidence of Catherine's true life, photos with presidents and CEOs, awards from technology foundations, patents framed on the walls like artwork. The first move had been surgical but devastating, and it had happened exactly 3 days after the exile. David had arrived at work to find his keycard deactivated, but when he'd gone to reception to complain, security had been waiting to escort him to the executive boardroom. Catherine had been there, but she'd been sitting at the head of the table in a position David had never seen occupied, flanked by the CEO and CFO who'd always been his bosses. "Mr. Harrison," Catherine had said, but her voice had been arctic and absolute. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Catherine Monroe, founder and majority owner of Meridian Global Industries." David's face had gone through a spectacular range of expressions, but Emma had watched via video feed from her mother's penthouse, and she'd felt a savage satisfaction at his shock. "That's impossible," David had stammered, but his usual confidence had evaporated like a morning mist. "I assure you it's very possible," Catherine had replied, sliding a folder across the table, but David's hands had been shaking as he'd opened it. "That's documentation of every ethics violation you've committed in your 5 years here. Insider trading, sexual harassment, embezzlement, fraud. You've been very busy, Mr. Harrison." The color had drained from David's face, but he'd tried to bluster. "You can't prove any of this." "I can prove all of it," Catherine had countered, but her smile had been gentle, which had somehow been more terrifying than rage. "I've been watching you since the day you married my daughter. Every email, every transaction, every lie documented and preserved. Did you know we keep backups of all employee communications for 7 years? It's fascinating what people will write when they think no one's paying attention." David had stood abruptly, but security had moved to block the doors. "This is about Emma," he'd accused, but his voice had been desperate now. "You're mad because I left her." "I'm mad because you abused her," Catherine had corrected, but her voice had risen with suppressed fury. "I'm mad because you systematically isolated her from me, from her friends, from herself. I'm mad because you threw her out into the snow to die while your mistress laughed. But most of all, Mr. Harrison, I'm mad because you pushed my limits just to see if I'd bend." She'd leaned forward, but her eyes had been glacial. "I don't bend. I break people who threaten what's mine." The termination had been immediate and public, but Catherine had made sure David's disgrace was complete, leaked to the press through carefully managed channels, his face plastered across business news, with headlines screaming about ethical violations and abuse of power. The lawsuit had followed within days, but Meridian Global had been suing David for $15 million in damages, a sum his lawyer had quietly informed him was impossible to fight given the evidence. Veronica had been next, but her downfall had been swift and brutal. Catherine had discovered that Veronica had been embezzling company funds through false expense reports, but the amounts had been significant, over $200,000 across 3 years. The criminal charges had been filed before Veronica even knew she was under investigation, but the arrest had happened at the mansion, officers showing up while she'd been planning her wedding to David. Emma had watched this unfold with mixed emotions, but she'd found herself unable to feel the satisfaction she'd expected. The revenge had been complete and devastating, But it hadn't filled the hole in her heart where her marriage had been, hadn't erased the betrayal and humiliation she'd endured. "They're destroyed," Catherine had said one evening, as they'd sat together in the penthouse, but Emma had been staring out at the Manhattan skyline, feeling oddly empty. David's facing criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and bankruptcy. Veronica's looking at 5 years minimum for embezzlement. The mansion's been seized as part of the asset recovery. They have nothing. "I know," Emma had replied, but her voice had been flat. "I should feel happy about that." Catherine had studied her daughter carefully, but understanding had dawned in her eyes. "But you don't." "I'm just tired," Emma had admitted, but tears had started falling despite her best efforts to hold them back. "Tired of being angry, tired of thinking about him, tired of letting him take up space in my head even now." Her mother had pulled her close, but this time the embrace had been different, not protective or apologetic, but simply present. "Then let him go," Catherine had whispered, but it had been an invitation rather than an order. "Let all of it go, and let me show you what comes next." What came next had been revelation after revelation, but Catherine had slowly introduced Emma to her real world. The companies, the foundation, the vast network of influence and responsibility that would someday be Emma's to manage. Emma had been overwhelmed at first, but she'd discovered that her art history degree had given her skills she hadn't appreciated, an eye for detail, an understanding of value and authenticity, the ability to see the bigger picture. The gallery Emma had dreamed of opened 6 months later, but it had been funded by her mother's foundation and featured emerging artists from underprivileged backgrounds, giving them a platform they'd never have accessed otherwise. Emma had thrown herself into the work, but she'd found something she'd lost years ago in her marriage: purpose, passion, her own identity separate from being someone's wife. David's trial had been all over the news, but Emma hadn't attended, hadn't even watched the coverage. She'd been too busy building something real, something that mattered, something that was entirely hers. But she'd received updates through Catherine's lawyers. The criminal charges had resulted in a 3-year sentence, but the civil penalties had stripped him of everything: his reputation, his assets, his freedom. The day Emma had filed for divorce had been anticlimactic, but the papers had been delivered to David in prison, and his lawyer had reported that he'd signed without protest. Emma had expected to feel triumph, but instead she'd felt only a quiet sense of closure, the final page of a chapter she was ready to close. Veronica had tried to reach out from prison, but her letters had been pathetic things full of apologies and excuses, claiming she'd been manipulated by David, that she'd never meant to hurt anyone. Emma had read the first letter and thrown the rest away unopened, but she'd felt nothing except perhaps a distant pity for a woman who'd traded her integrity for a man who'd never valued her beyond her usefulness. The transformation of Emma's life had been total, but it had been gradual enough that she'd barely noticed until she'd looked back and realized she didn't recognize the broken woman who'd stood in the snow a year ago. Catherine had begun bringing her to board meetings, but Emma had discovered she had a talent for strategy and a ruthlessness when it came to protecting the company her mother had built. The other executives had been skeptical at first, but Emma had proven herself repeatedly, and eventually she'd earned their respect on her own merits rather than her mother's protection. The public revelation of Emma's identity as Catherine's daughter and heir had been carefully orchestrated, but it had still caused shockwaves through the business world. Forbes had done a cover story, but Emma had insisted on using the interview to talk about her mother's genius and legacy rather than her own story. The redemption narrative had been tempting, but Emma had refused to let David and Veronica take up even one more moment of her precious time. She'd started dating again eventually, but casually, with no pressure and absolute honesty about who she was and what she wanted. The men who were intimidated by her wealth and power weeded themselves out quickly, but Emma had discovered she preferred being alone to being with someone who made her smaller. 2 years after that frozen night, Emma had received word that David was being released early for good behavior, but the news had barely registered. She'd been in Milan for a gallery opening, but the artist she was featuring had been a young woman from Detroit, whose work explored themes of resilience and reinvention. And Emma had been far too excited about that to care about her ex-husband's movements. The confrontation she'd half expected never came, but Emma had learned through her security team that David had moved to a small town in Oregon, working as a sales clerk and living in a studio apartment. He'd tried to rebuild his reputation, but the internet had been unforgiving, his name forever tied to the scandal. Veronica had moved back to her hometown in Texas after her release, but she'd been working 3 jobs to pay off her restitution, her Instagram full of motivational quotes about perseverance that rang hollow given her crimes. Emma had thought she'd feel satisfaction knowing they'd been brought so low, but instead, she'd felt nothing. They'd simply ceased to be relevant to her life. Footnotes in a chapter. She'd moved beyond. The real victory had been internal, but it had come the day Emma had looked in the mirror and recognized herself again. Not the broken, diminished woman David had tried to create, but the strong, capable, passionate person she'd always been underneath. Catherine had been right. The best revenge hadn't been David's destruction, but Emma's resurrection. 3 years after the exile, Emma had stood in her gallery during a major exhibition, but she'd been watching her mother chat with a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer whose work hung on the walls. Catherine had looked radiant and proud, but more than that, she'd looked happy, relieved of the burden of secrets, finally able to share her true self with the daughter she loved. "You did good, Mom," Emma had said later, but they'd been alone in the gallery after closing, standing among the art and achievements and proof of how far they'd both come. "We did good," Catherine had corrected, but she'd pulled Emma into a hug that felt like homecoming and victory and love all woven together. "And we're just getting started." And they had been just getting started, but Emma had looked forward to the future with excitement rather than dread for the first time in years. David had taken so much from her, but he'd also inadvertently given her something precious, the chance to discover who she really was, the strength she didn't know she possessed, the relationship with her mother that had deepened into something unbreakable. As for David himself, he'd become what he'd always feared most, irrelevant, forgotten, a cautionary tale whispered in business schools about the dangers of hubris and cruelty. He'd wanted to climb to the top of the world, but he'd ended up exactly where Emma had started that frozen night, with nothing except the consequences of his choices and the slow, grinding realization that some falls are permanent. Emma had thought about reaching out once, but not to gloat or punish, simply to let him know she'd forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own, to finally release the last chain tying her to their shared past. But in the end, she'd decided against it. But that decision had been its own kind of closure, the recognition that David no longer deserved even her forgiveness, that the best thing she could give him was the absence of her attention. The snow had fallen that night 3 years ago, but it had buried one version of Emma Harrison and allowed another to emerge, stronger, wiser, loved, and finally free. David had thought pushing her out into the cold would destroy her, but instead it had forced her to find the warmth within herself, the fire her mother had kindled and protected all along, the light that no amount of cruelty could ever fully extinguish. And that, ultimately, had been the sweetest revenge of all. 5 years had passed since that frozen night, but Emma still remembered the bite of the wind with perfect clarity, not as trauma, but as transformation, the moment her old life had died so a new one could be born. She stood now in the executive boardroom of Meridian Global Industries, 40 stories above Manhattan, but the woman reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows bore little resemblance to the broken person David had discarded. Emma was 33 now, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been tested by fire and emerged as steel rather than ash. "Ms. Monroe, the Tokyo office is on line 3, her assistant Marcus announced, but he'd barely finished speaking when Catherine swept into the room. Her auburn hair now streaked with distinguished silver she no longer bothered to hide. "Tell them we'll call back in 20 minutes, Catherine said, but her tone was warm rather than imperious. "I need to steal my daughter for a moment." Emma raised an eyebrow but followed her mother to the small terrace attached to the boardroom, but the November air carried the same crisp bite as that night 5 years ago, and she had to suppress a shiver that was more memory than cold. Catherine noticed anyway, she always noticed, but she simply handed Emma the coffee she'd been carrying, the gesture both practical and symbolic in its care. "The Grayson merger closes tomorrow," Catherine said, but she wasn't looking at Emma, instead gazing out at the city sprawling beneath them. "Once that's finalized, you'll officially control 51% of the company's voting shares. I'll retain advisory capacity, but Meridian will be yours." Emma had known this was coming. They'd been planning the transition for 2 years, but hearing it stated so baldly still made her heart race. "Are you sure?" she asked, but the question felt inadequate for the magnitude of what her mother was offering. "I've never been more sure of anything," Catherine replied, but now she turned to face Emma fully, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You've proven yourself 100 times over. The board respects you. The shareholders trust you. More importantly, you understand what this company should be. Not just profitable, but purposeful. You're ready." Emma wanted to argue, but she knew it would be false modesty, and Catherine had taught her better than that. "What will you do?" she asked instead, but she could see the answer already forming in her mother's smile. "Live," Catherine said simply, but the word carried depths of meaning. "Travel without checking my phone every 5 minutes. Spend time at the beach house. Maybe even date, though at 68 I'm not sure I remember how." She laughed, but the sound was lighter than Emma had heard in years. "I spent 40 years building something extraordinary, but I want to spend whatever time I have left remembering why I built it, for moments like this, for the people I love, for the freedom to choose what comes next." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, but Emma felt the weight of legacy settling on her shoulders. Not oppressive, but grounding, a reminder of responsibility and possibility intertwined. "I won't let you down," she said quietly, but Catherine shook her head. "You couldn't if you tried," her mother replied, but she squeezed Emma's hand with fierce pride. "Now come on, we have a company to run for 1 more day, and then tomorrow it's all yours." The merger closing the next day was a media spectacle, but Emma had learned to navigate the cameras and questions with the same grace her mother had always employed when she'd finally stepped into the public eye. Forbes was there, but so was Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, and a dozen technology publications eager to document the official passing of power from Catherine Monroe to her daughter Emma Monroe. She'd legally dropped the Harrison name 3 years ago in a moment of cathartic symbolism. "Ms. Monroe, how does it feel to inherit one of the world's largest technology companies at 33? A reporter called out, but Emma smiled, her answer prepared but genuine. "I'm not inheriting it, I'm continuing it," she replied, but her voice carried clearly through the conference room. "My mother built something revolutionary, but she also built something sustainable. My job isn't to reinvent Meridian, but to guide it into its next chapter while honoring the principles she established: innovation, integrity, and impact. Those were her watchwords, and they'll be mine. The questions had continued for another 20 minutes, but Emma had handled them all with aplomb, and when the press had finally filed out, Catherine had pulled her aside with a conspiratorial grin. "You're a natural," she'd said, but her pride had been evident in every word. "Much better at this than I ever was." "I learned from the best," Emma had replied, but the exchange had been interrupted by Marcus, who'd looked unusually uncomfortable as he'd approached. "Ms. Monroe, Emma, there's someone here to see you," he'd said, but his hesitation had sent alarm bells ringing. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he's very insistent. Says his name is David Harrison." The world had seemed to stop for a moment, but Emma had felt Catherine go rigid beside her, protective instinct flaring instantly. Emma had taken a deep breath, but when she'd spoken, her voice had been steady. "Does he know I'm aware he's here?" "Security alerted me first," Marcus had confirmed, but his hand had hovered near his phone, ready to call for backup. "He's in the lobby. He looks rough. Should I have him removed?" Emma had considered for a long moment, but she'd felt Catherine's hand on her arm, a silent question. "Do you want to do this? Or should I make him disappear?" But Emma had realized something important in that suspended instant. She wasn't afraid anymore, wasn't hurt anymore, wasn't anything anymore when it came to David Harrison, except curious about what kind of man he'd become in 5 years of consequences. "I'll see him," Emma had decided, but she'd held up a hand when Catherine had started to protest. "Alone, just for 5 minutes. I need to know if there's any closure left to find, or if I already found it." The elevator ride down to the lobby had felt eternal, but Emma had used the time to center herself, to remember who she was now versus who she'd been, to armor herself not with anger but with indifference, the most powerful weapon of all. The doors had opened, but the man sitting in the waiting area had looked so diminished compared to her memories that she'd almost felt sorry for him. David had aged badly in 5 years, but that was the kindest way to describe it. His hair had thinned and grayed prematurely, but his expensive suits had been replaced by a wrinkled button-down and cheap slacks. He'd lost weight, but in an unhealthy way that made him look gaunt rather than fit. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. The cocky confidence replaced by something hollow and desperate that made Emma's stomach twist with uncomfortable pity. "Emma," he'd said, standing quickly but awkwardly, and she'd noticed his hands were shaking. "Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would." "I have 5 minutes," Emma had replied, but she'd kept her distance, made no move to shake his hand or engage in any false pleasantries. "What do you want, David?" He'd flinched at her tone, but he'd deserved worse, and they both knew it. "I saw the news about the merger, about you taking over. I needed to." He'd trailed off, but the words had seemed to stick in his throat like broken glass. "Apologize," Emma had suggested, but her voice had been clinical rather than cruel. "Congratulate me. Beg for money. I'm genuinely curious which script you practiced." "All of it," David had admitted, but he'd collapsed back into the chair as though his legs couldn't support him. "God, Emma, all of it and none of it. I don't even know anymore." He'd looked up at her then, but his eyes had been red-rimmed and desperate. "I destroyed everything. You, me, my career, my life. I wake up every day in a studio apartment in Portland, working retail for minimum wage, and I wonder how I became this person, how I threw away something real for what? Ambition? Pride? Veronica?" Emma had felt nothing at the mention of his former mistress's name, but that numbness had been its own kind of victory. "What happened to Veronica?" she'd asked, but only because morbid curiosity had gotten the better of her. "Gone," David had said flatly, but his laugh had been bitter and self-loathing. "She dumped me 3 weeks after I got out of prison, said I was dead weight, that she'd only been with me for my money and connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd rubbed his face with trembling hands, but when he'd looked up again, there had been tears streaming down his cheeks. I was so sure I had everything figured out, so sure I was the smartest person in the room, but your mother, she played me like a violin. She knew exactly what I was from day one, and she let me hang myself with my own rope. She did, Emma had confirmed, but she'd felt no need to soften the blow. She also would have left you alone if you'd just been a mediocre husband. Bad even. But you weren't content with that. You had to be cruel. David had nodded, but the gesture had been defeated rather than argumentative. That night, the snow. I replay it constantly. The look on your face when I pushed you. Your mother trying to protect you. Veronica laughing. He'd started sobbing then, but the sound had been raw and animal, the breakdown of a man who'd lost everything and finally understood why. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not even asking for help, though God knows I need it. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I see what I did, that I would give anything to go back and be different. Emma had stood very still, but she'd examined her feelings like a surgeon probing for damaged tissue, searching for pain or anger or even satisfaction at his suffering. But there had been nothing except a distant, abstract pity, the kind you might feel for a stranger who'd made catastrophically bad choices, but not someone who'd once shared your life and bed. I believe you're sorry, Emma had said finally, but her voice had been neither warm nor cold, simply factual. I believe you suffer. I believe you've lost everything and that it hurts. But David, here's the thing. I don't care. She'd let the words land, but she'd watched his face crumple with something that might have been relief or devastation or both. I don't care because you're not my problem anymore. You're not my responsibility, my burden, my anything. You're just a person who treated me badly, faced consequences, and now has to live with those consequences. That's it. That's all you are to me. I know, David had whispered, but the words had been barely audible. I know, and that's worse somehow than if you hated me. At least hatred means I still matter. You don't, Emma had said, but it hadn't been cruel, just honest. Perhaps the most honest she'd ever been with him. You did once. You mattered so much that your betrayal nearly broke me. But I healed, David. I grew. I became someone I'm proud of, someone strong and capable and loved. And none of that has anything to do with you. She'd turned to leave then, but David's voice had stopped her one final time. Are you happy? He'd asked. But the question had carried genuine curiosity rather than manipulation. Emma had looked back at him, but she'd smiled, a real smile full of warmth and truth and hard-won peace. Incredibly, she'd answered. I'm doing work that matters. I have a relationship with my mother that's deeper than I ever imagined possible. I have friends who value me for who I am, not what I can give them. I wake up excited for the day ahead rather than dreading it. So yes, David, I'm happy, happier than I've ever been, and happier than you could have ever made me, even if you'd tried. The elevator doors had closed on his broken expression, but Emma had felt lighter rather than heavier as she'd ascended back to her office, back to her life, back to the future she'd built from the ashes of their marriage. Catherine had been waiting when she'd emerged, but her mother's face had been tight with controlled worry. Are you okay? Catherine had asked, but Emma had pulled her into a fierce hug. I'm perfect, Emma had said, but she'd meant it with every fiber of her being. He's just small now, sad and small and powerless, and I felt nothing except relief that I'm not him, that I'm not carrying around that kind of regret and self-loathing. I won. You did, Catherine had agreed, but she'd held Emma at arm's length, studying her face carefully. Not because he fell, but because you rose. That's the difference. The months that followed had been a whirlwind, but Emma had thrown herself into running Meridian with the passion and precision her mother had modeled. She'd launched 3 new initiatives in her first 6 months: a scholarship program for underprivileged STEM students, but particularly focusing on young women who faced the same barriers Catherine had encountered decades ago; a venture capital fund for female entrepreneurs, but with mentorship components that went beyond just money; and a company-wide review of pay equity and promotion practices, but with transparent metrics and third-party auditing to ensure accountability. The business press had been skeptical at first, but Emma's initiatives had proven both profitable and purposeful, and within a year, Meridian's stock had risen 23%, while employee satisfaction scores had hit all-time highs. Emma had proven she wasn't just Catherine's daughter, but a formidable leader in her own right, but she'd done it by being authentically herself, rather than trying to imitate anyone else. Her personal life had flourished too, but in unexpected ways. She'd met Rebecca at a charity auction, an environmental lawyer with sharp wit and zero tolerance for pretension, but their friendship had deepened into something more over late-night conversations about changing the world and whether it was possible to have power without becoming corrupted by it. Rebecca hadn't been intimidated by Emma's wealth or position, but she'd also called Emma out when she got too caught up in work, reminding her that life existed beyond boardrooms and quarterly reports. "You're going to burn out if you keep this pace," Rebecca had said one evening as they'd shared dinner at Emma's penthouse, but her tone had been gentle rather than critical. "Your mom didn't spend 40 years building this company just so you could sacrifice your health and happiness to maintain it." Emma had started to argue, but Rebecca had raised an eyebrow in that way she had, half amused, half exasperated, and Emma had laughed instead. "You're right," she'd admitted, but she'd reached across the table to take Rebecca's hand. "I'm still learning how to not prove myself to ghosts." "David?" Rebecca had asked, but Emma had shaken her head. "Not even him anymore, just the old version of myself, the one who wasn't enough, who had to earn her place, who believed love was something you traded your identity for." Emma had squeezed Rebecca's hand, but her eyes had been clear and certain. "But I'm learning. You're helping me learn." They'd been together for 18 months now, but Emma had been careful not to rush, not to recreate patterns from her marriage that had led to codependency and loss of self. Rebecca had been patient, but she'd also been clear about her boundaries and expectations, and their relationship had flourished in the space between independence and intimacy. Catherine had adored Rebecca on sight, but the two women had bonded over their shared exasperation with Emma's workaholic tendencies and formed a united front in forcing her to take vacations and actually use her personal time. Emma had pretended to be annoyed, but secretly she'd loved having people who cared enough to push back, who saw her as more than just a CEO or an heiress, but as a whole person worthy of rest and joy and silly romantic comedies on Sunday afternoons. The gallery had continued to thrive too, but Emma had expanded it to include artist residency programs and free community workshops, making art accessible to people who'd never imagined they belonged in that world. She'd curated shows that challenged viewers, but that also celebrated beauty and resilience and the human capacity for reinvention. Critics had called her work transformative, but Emma had just smiled, knowing she was living proof that transformation was always possible if you had the courage to let yourself break and reform. 2 years after taking over Meridian, Emma had received an unexpected letter, but the return address had been a women's prison in Texas. Veronica had written her 5 pages of apologies and explanations and desperate attempts to justify her choices, but also genuine seeming remorse that had made Emma pause. "I was so jealous of you," Veronica had written in one section, but the handwriting had been shaky, evidence of the years and consequences that had aged her prematurely. You had everything I thought I wanted: money, status, a husband who looked good on paper, but I was too stupid to see that what you really had was character, integrity, a mother who loved you unconditionally. I traded all of that for things that meant nothing, and now I have nothing at all except time to think about what I destroyed." Emma had sat with the letter for days, but she'd ultimately decided to respond, not to absolve Veronica or offer false forgiveness, but to close that chapter with truth rather than silence. Her response had been brief but honest. "I hope you find peace with your choices and rebuild your life into something you can be proud of. But my forgiveness isn't something you need to move forward, and my presence in your life wouldn't help either of us heal. I wish you well, but at a distance. Take care of yourself." She'd never heard from Veronica again, but Emma had felt satisfied with that closure, neither cruel nor accommodating, just honest and final. The 5-year anniversary of that frozen night arrived on a Tuesday, but Emma had taken the day off, a rarity that had made her assistant's jaw drop. She'd driven upstate to the house Catherine had bought after retiring, but the sprawling property overlooked a lake that reminded Emma of childhood vacations before everything had gotten so complicated. Catherine had been in her garden when Emma arrived, but she'd looked younger somehow, lighter. The burden of secrets and corporations finally lifted from her shoulders. They'd spent the afternoon cooking together, something they'd rarely had time for during Emma's childhood, but the kitchen had been filled with laughter and flour dust, and the kind of easy companionship that only comes from surviving darkness together and choosing light. "Do you ever think about that night?" Emma had asked as they'd sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the lake, but her voice had been curious rather than pained. "Every day," Catherine had admitted, but she'd smiled as she'd said it. Not with regret exactly, more like gratitude. "Gratitude," Emma had repeated, but she'd been surprised by the word choice. "That it happened when it did," Catherine had explained, but she'd turned to face Emma fully. "Another year, and David might have gotten you pregnant. Another 5 years, and the pattern might have been so ingrained you couldn't break it. Another decade, and—" She'd trailed off, but they'd both known what she meant. The timing was terrible, but also perfect. It broke you open right when you were still young enough to rebuild stronger. It forced me to stop hiding and finally be the mother you deserved. It cleared away everything false so we could build something real." Emma had nodded slowly, but she'd found herself agreeing despite the pain those memories still occasionally carried. "I wouldn't go back," she'd said, but the realization had felt profound. "Even if I could prevent all of it, the marriage, the betrayal that night, I wouldn't. Because then I wouldn't be this person, living this life, with you and Rebecca, and work that matters." "That's how you know you've truly healed," Catherine had said, but she'd pulled Emma close in a sideways hug. "When you wouldn't trade the person you became for the pain you avoided. When you see your scars as proof of survival rather than evidence of damage." They'd sat in comfortable silence as the sky had turned pink and gold, but Emma had felt more at peace than she'd ever remembered feeling. Not because her life was perfect, but because it was wholly, authentically hers. 3 months later, Forbes had run another cover story, but this time the headline had read, "Emma Monroe, the CEO redefining ethical tech leadership at 34. The article had been comprehensive, but it had covered everything from her business philosophy to her personal journey, and the writer had done something Emma had appreciated. They'd presented her failed marriage not as tragedy or scandal, but as context for understanding her values around loyalty, integrity, and second chances. "I don't define myself by what was done to me," Emma had said in the interview, but the quote had been pulled out as a highlight box. "I define myself by what I chose to do afterward, by the company I chose to lead ethically, by the relationships I chose to nurture honestly, by the life I chose to build authentically. David Harrison was a chapter in my story, but he's not the moral, and he's definitely not the author. I am. The article had gone viral, but Emma had been flooded with messages from women and men who'd survived their own versions of betrayal and abuse, who'd found inspiration in her journey from victim to victor. She'd responded to as many as she could, but she'd also established a foundation specifically to help domestic abuse survivors rebuild their lives with job training, legal support, and counseling services. "You're doing too much," Rebecca had said one evening, as Emma had worked on foundation proposals at midnight, but her girlfriend had been smiling even as she'd closed Emma's laptop. "There's no such thing as too much when it comes to helping people," Emma had protested, but Rebecca had pulled her to her feet and into a slow dance to music only they could hear. "There is when it comes at the expense of your own well-being," Rebecca had countered, but she'd kissed Emma softly, cutting off any further argument. "The work will be there tomorrow. Right now, be here, with me. Just be." Emma had let herself surrender to the moment, but she'd realized Rebecca was teaching her something Catherine had tried to model, but Emma had been too traumatized to learn earlier. That rest wasn't weakness, that boundaries weren't selfishness, that saying no to good things to protect her energy for great things was actually the most powerful choice she could make. 7 years after the exile, Emma had been invited to give the commencement speech at her alma mater, but she'd been terrified in a way that board meetings and press conferences had never made her feel. Standing before thousands of graduates and their families, but knowing her words might shape how they approached their futures, had felt like sacred responsibility. "You will be betrayed," she'd said at one point in the speech, but the audience had gone very quiet. "Someone you trust will hurt you. Someone you love will fail you. Something you built will crumble. And in that moment, you will have a choice. Let it define you, or let it refine you." She'd paused, but she'd made eye contact with as many people as she could. "I chose refinement. I let the fire burn away everything that wasn't essential, the people-pleasing, the self-doubt, the idea that my value came from someone else's assessment of me. What remained was stronger, truer, more resilient. So when betrayal comes, and it will come, remember, you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become afterward." The standing ovation had lasted 5 minutes, but Emma had cried through most of it, overwhelmed by the realization that her pain had become purpose, her tragedy had become testimony, her survival had become service to others still fighting their way through darkness. Catherine had been in the audience, but so had Rebecca, and afterward they'd taken Emma to dinner at a small Italian restaurant that had nothing to do with wealth or status or achievement, just good food and great company and the simple pleasure of being together. Emma had looked around the table at the 2 women who'd saved her in different ways, but she'd felt a surge of gratitude so profound it had stolen her breath. "What is it?" Rebecca had asked, but she'd been watching Emma's face with the careful attention that had first made Emma fall in love with her. "Just happy," Emma had said, but the words had felt inadequate. "Happy and grateful and aware of how close I came to missing all of this. If David hadn't shown me who he really was, I might have stayed, might have spent decades slowly dying in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside but was poison on the inside. Him pushing me out into the snow was the cruelest gift he ever gave me, the gift of having to save myself." "Two cruel gifts," Catherine had said, raising her wine glass, but her eyes had been bright with unshed tears of pride and relief and love. "To becoming who we're meant to be," Rebecca had added, but she'd clinked her glass against the others. "To second chances and second selves," Emma had finished, but as she'd sipped her wine, She'd thought about David, not with anger or pity anymore, but with the kind of distant acknowledgement you might give to a storm that had destroyed your old house, but led you to build a better one. She'd heard through the grapevine that he'd moved again, but this time to a small town in Vermont where he'd been working at a non-profit, helping former inmates transition back into society. Someone had told someone who'd told Emma's assistant that David had found religion or therapy or both and was trying to make amends by helping people who'd made mistakes like his. Emma had felt nothing about this information except a vague hope that it was real transformation rather than performance, but either way, it was no longer her concern. Veronica had apparently remarried, but her new husband was a plumber who'd never heard of her past and didn't care about status or wealth or any of the things she'd once valued above everything else. Emma had hoped that was true, but she'd also hoped Veronica had learned that happiness couldn't be stolen from someone else, only built within yourself. The years continued to pass, but Emma's life kept expanding in directions she'd never anticipated. She'd been approached about running for political office, but she'd declined, preferring to influence policy through lobbying and philanthropy rather than direct participation. She'd written a book about ethical leadership, but it had become a bestseller despite her minimal promotion, resonating with a generation tired of corporate greed and moral compromise. Rebecca had proposed on a beach in Greece, but the ring had been simple and the moment had been private, just the two of them and the sunset and the weight of a future they'd chosen together. Emma had said yes without hesitation, but she'd also cried happy tears for the first time in years, overwhelmed by how different this felt from David's proposal. There was no ownership here, no expectation that she'd become smaller to make her partner feel bigger, just two equals choosing partnership from a place of wholeness rather than need. Catherine had walked Emma down the aisle at the wedding, but the ceremony had been small and intimate, just close friends and chosen family celebrating love that was built on honesty and respect and genuine admiration. Emma had looked around at the faces witnessing her vows, but she'd seen no one from her old life with David. Those bridges had been burned and scattered to the wind, and she'd felt no regret about their absence. "I promise to never make myself smaller to make you feel bigger," Emma had said in her vows, but the words had felt like reclaiming power she'd once given away. "I promise to challenge you and support you and love you as you are, not as I wish you to be. I promise to be honest even when it's hard, present even when it's inconvenient, and committed even when it's scary. I promise to be your partner, your equal, your person, not your savior or your project or your consolation prize, but your choice and your joy and your home." Rebecca had cried, but so had Catherine, and Emma had felt the healing that comes from rewriting your story, not by erasing the painful chapters, but by ensuring they led somewhere beautiful and true and worth every tear spilled along the way. 10 years after that frozen night, Emma had been named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people, but the recognition had felt surreal. Little Emma Harrison, who'd once been thrown out of her own home like garbage, now shaping global conversations about technology ethics and corporate responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she'd learned to embrace paradox as part of the human experience. The feature had included a sidebar about her journey, but it had mentioned David Harrison exactly once. Monroe survived a difficult first marriage before finding both professional success and personal happiness. And Emma had appreciated the writer's choice to make him a footnote rather than the central narrative. Her story wasn't about him and never had been, but it had taken years to realize that trauma doesn't have to be the defining chapter even when it's the most dramatic one. She'd heard David had read the article, but a mutual acquaintance had reported that he'd only said, "Good for her, she deserved better than me," and I'm glad she found it." Emma had appreciated that, but she'd felt no need to reach out or acknowledge it. Some wounds heal better when left undisturbed, the scar tissue stronger than the original flesh had ever been. Catherine had turned 75 that year, but she'd shown no signs of slowing down, traveling 6 months out of the year and pursuing hobbies she'd deferred for decades. She'd learned to paint, but her work was surprisingly good. Abstract pieces that captured emotion through color and movement, and Emma had featured her in the gallery's Emerging Artist show, insisting she apply under a pseudonym so her acceptance would be based on merit rather than connection. "You didn't have to do that," Catherine had said, when Emma had revealed that her submission had been selected by the curator without knowing who she was. But her pride had been evident in her shining eyes. "I wanted you to know what I've always known," Emma had replied, but she'd hugged her mother tightly, "that you're extraordinary not because of what you built or how much money you made, but because of who you are, creative, resilient, loving, brave. The company was impressive, but you as a person are magnificent." Rebecca had given Emma a daughter through IVF when Emma was 37, but little Catherine, named for her grandmother but called Cat to avoid confusion, had become the center of Emma's universe in ways she'd never anticipated. Holding her daughter for the first time, but knowing this child would grow up with a mother who modeled strength and authenticity and self-worth, had felt like the ultimate redemption of everything Emma had survived. "She'll never know what you went through," Rebecca had said one night as they'd watched Cat sleep in her crib, but Emma had shaken her head gently. "She'll know," Emma had countered, but her voice had been thoughtful rather than sad. "When she's old enough to understand, I'll tell her age appropriately, not to traumatize her, but to teach her that survival is possible, that pain can become purpose, that who you are at your worst moment doesn't determine who you become." She'd kissed Rebecca's temple, but her eyes had remained on their daughter. "She'll know her mother was broken once, but she'll also know her mother chose to heal, to grow, to build something beautiful from the rubble, and maybe that will help her when she faces her own darkness." Emma had thought about David occasionally over the years, but with less frequency until he'd become barely a memory, a character from someone else's story that she'd heard once but couldn't quite recall the details of. She'd heard he'd died when she was 42, a heart attack, sudden and mercifully quick, but she'd felt only a distant sadness for a life that had been wasted in so many ways. She hadn't attended the funeral, but she'd sent flowers with a card that read simply, "May you find peace that eluded you in life." It had felt like the right gesture, acknowledging his death without claiming any relationship to it, offering compassion without inviting his ghost back into her story. Veronica had reached out after David's death, but her email had been brief and surprisingly mature. "I know we have history, but I wanted you to know that David spoke of you often in his last years. He said you were the only person who'd ever really loved him for who he was, rather than what you could get from him. And he regretted every day that he'd been too broken to appreciate that until it was too late. I'm sorry for my part in your pain. I hope you're well." Emma had read the email 3 times, but she'd ultimately decided not to respond, not out of cruelty, but because there was simply nothing left to say. That chapter had closed so long ago that reopening it, even for closure, felt unnecessary. But she'd hoped Veronica had found her own healing, her own path to becoming someone she could be proud of. The company had continued to thrive under Emma's leadership, but she'd expanded it beyond technology into renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and healthcare innovation. She'd become known as a CEO who prioritized long-term impact over short-term profits, but paradoxically, that approach had made Meridian more profitable than ever. Proof that ethics and success weren't mutually exclusive if you had the courage to hold both simultaneously. Rebecca had made partner at her law firm, but they'd navigated the complexities of two ambitious careers and parenthood with the same honest communication that had defined their relationship from the beginning. They'd fought sometimes, but they'd always fought fair, and they'd always remembered they were on the same team, even when they disagreed about tactics. Catherine had lived to see Kat's 10th birthday, but she'd passed peacefully in her sleep at 85, surrounded by evidence of a life extraordinarily well lived. Emma had grieved deeply, but she'd also felt grateful for the years they'd had after finally being honest with each other, for the relationship they'd built on truth rather than secrets, for the legacy of strength and integrity Catherine had modeled until her final breath. The funerals had been attended by hundreds, CEOs and politicians, but also scholarship recipients and employees whose lives Catherine had touched through small kindnesses and large gestures alike. Emma had given the eulogy, but she'd focused not on her mother's business achievements, but on her capacity for reinvention, her courage in revealing her true self, her wisdom in knowing when to hold on and when to let go. "She taught me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be," Emma had said, but her voice had been strong despite her tears. That hiding yourself to stay safe ultimately costs more than the vulnerability of being seen. That love requires honesty, even when honesty is painful. That the best revenge against those who hurt you isn't their suffering, but your flourishing. She'd looked at Kat, sitting in the front row, but her daughter's solemn face had reminded Emma so much of Catherine that her heart had ached with bittersweet love. "She taught me to rise, and I did. And I'll spend the rest of my life teaching others to do the same." Emma was 50 now, but she'd been running Meridian for 17 years, longer than Catherine had run it publicly, though shorter than her mother's hidden reign. She'd announced her intention to step down at 55, but not to retire, to transition into full-time philanthropy and mentoring the next generation of ethical leaders. The board had already approved her successor, a brilliant woman named Jade Chen, who'd risen through the ranks on merit and shared Emma's vision for what corporate power could become when wielded with conscience. Kat was 13 now and showed every sign of inheriting the best of both her mothers, Rebecca's fierce sense of justice and Emma's creative problem-solving, but also a unique kindness that was entirely her own. She'd asked about David once, but Emma had told her the truth in age-appropriate terms, that her first marriage had been to someone who'd hurt her, but that pain had led her to her mom, Rebecca, and eventually to Kat herself. And wasn't it funny how sometimes the worst things led to the best things if you didn't give up? Kat had thought about that for a long moment, but then she'd hugged Emma tightly and said, "I'm glad he was mean to you then, because otherwise I wouldn't be here." And Emma had laughed even as she'd cried, because children had a way of cutting through complexity to find truth. And the truth was that her daughter's existence had been worth every moment of suffering that had preceded it. Emma still drove past the old mansion sometimes, but it had been sold and resold multiple times since David's bankruptcy, and the current owners had renovated it so extensively that Emma barely recognized it. She'd felt nothing looking at it, no pain, no anger, no wistfulness, just the abstract curiosity of seeing a place where important events had occurred to a person she used to be. The snow still fell in Manhattan winters, but Emma had learned to love it rather than fear it. Those frozen crystals had witnessed her lowest moment, but they'd also preceded her highest transformation. She'd sometimes stand at her office window watching the snow blanket the city, but she'd think about that night 25 years ago and marvel at the distance between that broken woman and who she'd become. Rebecca would find her there occasionally, but she'd wrap her arms around Emma from behind and rest her chin on her shoulder, and they'd watch the snow together in comfortable silence. Emma had built a life beyond her wildest dreams from that night of exile, But the real victory wasn't the money or the power or the recognition. It was the woman she'd become, the love she'd found, the daughter she was raising to never accept less than she deserved. David Harrison had thought pushing Emma into the snow would destroy her, but instead it had freed her. From him, from fear, from the prison of being small to make others feel big. And in the end, that frozen night had been the beginning of everything that mattered, but also the ending of everything that didn't. Emma had survived. She'd thrived. She'd won. But more importantly, she'd learned that winning didn't require her opponent's destruction, only her own reconstruction, and that, in the arithmetic of human resilience, would always be the greater victory.